This is House Planning Help episode 339. Hi there, I'm Ben Adam Smith, and this is the podcast for you if you're interested in self-build or retrofit. I'm exploring what houses we should be building in the 21st century and trying to break down the major roadblocks that may get in our way. Coming up in this session, my guest is Mark Brinkley, author of the Housebuilder's Bible. We're going to get an overview of what the book is all about, who it's trying to help, and how it does that. But we're going to start with a quick mind-reading exercise. So bear with me here. It's the beginning of the episode where I like to share a resource. So say the first thing that comes into your mind. Today's resource is... Yeah, of course, it's the Housebuilder's Bible. Well, I have to do that. Do you know, I don't think there's another book that I actually feel comfortable recommending. Part of that, I suppose, is one of its strengths and also challenges for Mark is that it's always up to date. It gets revised every couple of years, and whether that's the costs or the themes, some of those we're going to talk about today. And Mark's been on the podcast a few times before. We've talked about various different aspects. I'm not sure we've talked about the book in the same depth that we're going to today, but, you know, better late than never. And a couple of reasons why this book is very relevant. You've got Mark having invested in it for decades now and going through it, trying to refine it as well. It's a life's work, really, isn't it? And there will be places where you might even laugh out loud reading the book. It's got a lot of Mark in this, and that's why we like it. It's very helpful. Obviously, I'm not going to be recommending something that isn't. So, yes. Another thing that's quite strange for me is that we almost built at the same time because his latest project, we were fairly in sync. So that's where we start things today. And I asked Mark how he reflects on the latest house build.
It seems like a dream. I mean, it's such hard work when you're wrapped up in the middle of it. So all-enveloping that you can't think beyond the end of your own nose. You know, the to-do list is eternally long and you're pondering how you do this, that and the other, and how are you going to do this, and who, where's so-and-so, and gradually it sort of falls away and you're living in a lovely house. And we've got a photograph, a montage of all the people that worked on it, and we look at it now 5 years on, and it just seems like a dream, really, no more than that. There's one or two regrets. Our biggest regret about this house is that we put a gas boiler in. We ahed and ummed about putting a heat pump in. We actually got a quote for a ground source heat pump with a borehole going down. I think it was 50 metres, which is a mind-boggling amount. But it's quite a small garden, and we thought, well, no, let's go with it. And we were so concentrated on fabric first and the sort of passive house ideal that we thought it doesn't really matter. There'll be so little heat going out of the house that it doesn't matter what we use. That's true to an extent, but the problem is having gone down the gas boiler route, it's because of the constrictions of the site, it's going to be very hard to ever fit a heat pump because we've got no room either side, and if we go out the back we can't get into the plant room, and so we're stuck with it. Interestingly, that was our decision on that was made in about 2016, 2017, and at the time that seemed like a quite sensible thing to do. Now it feels like a real mistake. It's not long ago, really, is it?
But Mark, that's exactly the same thing at the top of my list too. So I think that goes to reflect that this was the thinking. Small amounts of gas is all you're going to be using.
Yeah, well, and we don't use an awful lot of it, you know, but it still irks me because part of the point of this whole exercise is to get off fossil fuels, isn't it? And that is a big minus when you're trying to get off fossil fuels.
And what about how the layout and how the home has delivered your day-to-day needs and so forth? How has it been as a home? It's
been an absolutely lovely house to live in. Really surprised how much we love it, really. It's beautifully spacious, particularly the room at the back of the house, which is the kitchen and the living room. It's an interesting design exercise because it was previously a warehouse and it was 6 metres wide, 20 metres long, and we've kept pretty much to that same footprint with our house. But because there's properties on the side walls, the 20-metre walls are both on boundaries with neighbours, we weren't able to have more than little skylights in the side walls. So we have essentially a long dark tunnel, And the design exercise to get around that was to put a big expanse of triple glazed roof light over the centre of the kitchen, which is a stunning effect. It really brings the whole place to life. And it's just a lovely space to be in. You know, you're in there on the coldest of days, cooking breakfast in bare feet and with the underfloor heating trickling up, and it's just a great feeling. It's a lovely space to be in. The other thing that's well worth mentioning is the ventilation system. I mean, it's the unsexiest thing in the world, but it's a lovely feeling. You come in on a cold, wet winter's day, and you just open the door and you walk into a wall of warmth. You must know that as well. And it just says, oh, love's, so, you know, the world isn't such a bad place after all.
And what about overheating? That's one element of passive house that people like to keep tabs on. How has that been for your design?
I think we've got it half right. I think we could have done better. The big areas of glass are in the kitchen and at the back of the house, where there's big sliding doors going out to the garden. Everything on the south side and at the back is low G solar heat resistant glass, which works up to a point, but it's not as good as blinds. But blinds with an overhead light are virtually impossible to fit anyway. I'm not quite sure how we would have got around that. And there are days when the temperature gets above 30. 3 summers ago, there was a heat wave that lasted best part of a week or 2 weeks, wasn't there? And by the end of that, we were getting temperatures coming up into the 30s, and it was quite uncomfortable. And we were thinking, maybe we got it wrong. But on the other hand, I'm not sure if it's that hot for that long. I'm not sure there's any system you can do, because it's really the nighttime temperature that's key, isn't it? And if you don't get below 20 at night, no amount of nighttime purging is really going to cool down. So maybe we could have done better, had a brise soleil maybe in the back door. But Mole, the architects, were quite onto it, and we didn't make the mistake of having a huge glazed gable. It's a sliding door, so we cut a lot of the heat out. We didn't put Veluxes in the sloping roof where we might have done. So it's pretty good, but I have been worried on the really hot days that we're not staying below the magic 25 degree figure that people are looking for. We're going up to 27, 28 overnight, you know, that sort of figure. How's yours been?
Yeah, mine has been good, again, up to a point. And there were a couple of interesting aspects. So one is that it was modelled never to go over 25 if you could do that purge that you're talking about. And I think it works exactly like that. But it does mean that there are always gains in the house. And I think that is the bit that, having travelled to more houses and seen different approaches, if you have some way of making sure there are no gains, you're into new territory. And it's very difficult because you're balancing so many different things. But the people who've done that, sometimes with things like verandas and where you wouldn't have the space here or be able to do that, but I've just seen some very clever control of the overheating, and I think that's desirable personally. The Housebuilder's Bible is back out again. You have done another edition. How is your energy for this?
I think when I finish it, I think that's the last time. I'm never doing another one. But it takes me the whole process takes about 3 months to do a new edition. And there comes a point sometime after Christmas, and I think, what am I going to do the rest of the winter? And I lock myself away in the studio at the end of the garden. And once I get into it, I really enjoy it. It's an extraordinary process, having done 15 editions of the same book. I've only ever written one book, but having done 15 editions of it, it really is my baby. I've had people proofread it and bits of editing, but 98% of it is me. And it feels like an extension of my personality. I realize it's quite a strange thing to do, because it's quite technical. There's a lot of figures and costs and quasi-scientific stuff in it. And I realise it's quite hard to explain that without writing it, and I find it very hard to think someone could just come in and take it over. And I think it's too much of me. And whether I'll do a 16th, I don't know, because I don't see why not. It still keeps going, and people still value it. I still try and make it as a great introduction to the whole idea of house building in general and self-build in particular. And I still get some really good feedback from all kinds of unexpected corners, from people who say, I really learnt a lot from this, thanks for doing it. So maybe I'll keep doing it, but I'm not on the road anymore. I don't do the shows anymore. I've step back from casual journalism. I'm semi-retired, but enjoy keeping it up. It's better than Sudoku.
Maybe you could explain a bit about how it comes together. What do you decide is important to go in? Are things shuffling around all the time? You know, you're some distance from the mindset of the person who knows nothing.
That's a very good question. It changes subtly. If I go back to the very first edition, when it was a very exciting but very tentative project, what I was trying to do was talk or write or think my way through the process of building a house. What do you need to know from the foundations through to the finish? What's the red tape? What are the stages? And right there and then, it sort of hangs together about 90%, but there's a load of stuff that just doesn't fit clearly into the jigsaw. And it's always ended up with a chapter at the back of the book, which I called the Apocrypha, because I thought that was a nice biblical reference of bits that didn't fit in the Bible. And there's lots of loose threads and stuff that just doesn't fit into the flow otherwise. And that's always been a problem. I guess it's the same whatever subject you do. You think of house, because it's a logical process from foundations through to painting it and finishing off the garden. And mostly it is, except there are lots of, when you get into the options about what you do and the different methods that you can use, then you have to stand back and discuss it from a completely different angle. And that still goes on. The main change of the last couple of editions has been looking at the whole heat pump, zero carbon, off fossil fuels house, which I think is now the standard house. Although, interestingly, my model house is still built with a gas boiler, because you can still put gas boilers in. So that affects the costs. It makes it, I don't know, $2 or $3 cheaper. On the scale of a new house, it's peanuts. But the idea of the model house, which I use as a reference point to show how you could build a simple house on a nice, easy site with very few complications to a comfortable but not fancy standard, that's always the starting point. And this is how you can do it better or more expensively or differently.
You mentioned in there about how 90% of the process you can almost map out. What would those stages be?
Everybody's journey starts slightly differently. For a self-builder, it starts probably with the idea, and then I remember you going through this process. You hadn't got a plot, had you? And you spent ages looking for a plot, and once you've got the plot, then the pieces start falling into place. Up till then, it's all fantasy. I might do this, I might do that. So you've got land, you have to start engaging with the planners. That's the point. There's a huge limitation on what you can build. Some people think they can build absolutely anything there. Welcome to the world of planning, and it's actually quite restrictive, although it's not that restrictive. It's amazing what the planners will let you get away with if you do it well. That's the first stage, is the conceptualisation of it. The second stage is to then get the detailed design drawn and go through the whole red tape, sorting out finance. And then you've got the budget problem of trying to juggle your aspirations with your means. And that's usually a problem for people. Often they've been to the shows, they've read the magazines, they've seen grand designs, they want this, that and the other, and then they find out the price attached and find out that actually they're building something much humbler. And then you have the project designed and ready to go. You have to find a builder. Again, the standard route is to go out to tender, get 3 or 4 builders to tender for it. That itself is tricky, because sometimes the builders are so busy they can't be bothered to tender, or they give you a really, really high price because they don't really want to do it. Other times you're getting low quotes coming in and you don't know the reputation of the builder is quite what it might be. That's another potential pitfall. You obviously don't want to get into bed with a cowboy builder, because that will end in tears. But how do you spot the cowboy builder? That's a whole chapter in itself, and how do you work with a builder constructively and well? Lots of stuff written about that by all kinds of people, but I've got my own particular take on it, and some people think I'm right, others think I'm completely wrong. So there isn't a correct way of doing it. And then you have to decide how much of a role you're going to play in the project. Are you going to let the builder get on with it? Maybe you have an architect supervising it and you just stand back and have a weekly visit and decide on the finishes. Or are you going to get actually involved in the project and become a helper or even a project manager, which is the route I chose on this house. And there you're basically hiring subcontractors to come in and you're supervising them and making sure that what they build is what's on the plans. It obviously helps to know a bit about building to do that. It's not probably something that rookies want to do. And you also it's very, very time consuming. Now, I did most of this house between editions of my book, and I wasn't doing a great deal of work outside, so I actually took the best part of a year to come in every morning. I was coming on my bicycle 7:15 in the morning, unlocking the fencing and staying there till lights out in the evening. Not everyone can do that because it's, you have so much time, So there are very different ways of going about it, and you need to make an assessment of what you're capable of, what you've got the time to do, and whether you think you're going to save money. Some people do that and actually end up costing more because they're so fiddly and pernickety. They keep sacking builders because they're not doing things the way they want them, and the job tends to spin out to infinity. Again, all you can really do is go through the different threads and stories and just point out the pros and cons of each. There's interesting stuff about the theory, the physics of building, how energy efficiency works, how soundproofing works, all this sort of stuff. So the editions have a habit of getting bigger and bigger and bigger because I'm adding more stuff in. Sometime about 5 editions ago, I realised it was turning something looking like a telephone directory. That's something you don't see anymore, isn't it? A telephone directory. So I started paring it down and started throwing bits out and thought, well, that's irrelevant and that's not helpful. So that was sculpting the book, if you like. And that's been a development. I'm still trying to simplify it and get down to the bare bones and try and make sure each edition is a few pages shorter than the one before.
Do you get feedback in how it is read? Because it could be read in a few different ways.
Interesting enough, yes. Particularly in the early days, I got some very funny feedback from people saying they kept it in the loo, and they'd sit there and read 3 pages, and wives complaining that their husband took it to bed with them in the evening and ignored them, and it sits in the spot where the Gideon's Bible was, People dip into it. It's a book you can dip into. It was designed to be something that you don't have to read from front to back. Someone was sailing across the Atlantic in a boat on their own. And he wrote to say he'd had that book with him and he completely changed his mind. But when he got back to England, he was going to do a job. He said, no, I'm going to build a house. And it's all through someone having given him a copy of the Housebuilder's Bible before his voyage. So there's all these odd stories about people getting into it and thinking, oh, this is a life-changing experience. And that's a great feeling, to come back and think that has had some effect. Some people have read it and changed their perspective on life. In a way, that's why I started doing it, because right back to the beginning, I was working in a building company in this very street in Cambridge, in Sedgwick Street, down the other end of the street, and we had a little company building flats. This is actually the second house I built in this very street, so the other one was in 1987. We were buying plots, and there was a market crash in 87, the famous Lawson bubble, where he got rid of double mortgage tax relief and the house market crashed overnight. And we had 3 plots on our books and lots of debt and where the hell we were going to go to it. And one of the ways was to put my emerging family of 3 little boys, was to build on one of our plots. And that was my first self-build. It was on one of our mistakes, if you like. And that process made me realise that really there was a need for a guidebook here, because I was struggling to, even though I was a professional builder, I'd built houses, doing it for yourself is very different. A house builder is building a magnolia box to sell, aren't they? And it's all pared down to everything. When you're trying to put your expression of what I want and what I don't want, and that in itself is difficult, because quite often at the beginning of the process you don't know. You've got to start reading around brochures and finishes and finding out about different designs of houses and different finishes and different floor types. There's a hell of a lot to know about it.
What do you actually recommend to people when they are in that stage? They're looking for land, nothing's happening really, they're dreaming. How do they do thorough research?
Well, that's changed, and that's much easier now, partly because of the net, things like Pinterest, which are coming up, mood boards, all this sort of stuff that didn't exist back in the 90s. And partly there's much more stuff out there commercially. There are these shows you can go to. There's a really interesting place to go is the National Self-Build and Renovation Centre in Swindon, which is now, about 20 years old, and it's got better and better and better. And spend a day there just looking at all the different options, and a lot of the self-build industry's got some sort of stand or explanatory leaflet of what they're doing. And you can pick up a lot going to that. There's another good place to go to is the Centre for Alternative Technology in Machynlleth in North Wales. It's always a fascinating place to visit, full of ideas and a bit more radical than the one in Swindon, but it's an eye-opener. And there are places like that you can go and see, expand your horizons about what's possible and what's feasible. And so there's built up a self-build industry helping people through this process. And all I can really do is point people towards that and go and find out. There's obviously TV shows, there's Grand Designs, there's George Clark's programs, there's lots of stuff you can casually watch on telly and soak it up, isn't there? But what there isn't is anything that cuts through the advertising stuff. That's what's difficult, because you go on the net and you're searching out information, and 90% of what you get is actually a sales feed, isn't it? The nugget of information you want, you can go in there and half an hour later you still haven't got what you wanted to find out. You've found lots of other external stuff, but the question you're asking is still unanswered. Now that's a really tricky one. So I can help with that a bit, but very often there are so many questions, you can only really have an opinion on it, and it's impossible to know that this product is always going to be the one that works, isn't it?
Now, I was having a listen back to some of the previous conversations we've had, and one line really stuck out to me in the first podcast we recorded, which was, the cost of building hasn't really changed that much. So this is obviously going back 10 years or so. How do you reflect on it today?
Well, that looks a bit silly now, doesn't it? Because the pandemic changed all that. We've had phenomenal building inflation in the last 2 years. Or it's 3 now, isn't it?
I think even before the pandemic, prices were really going up.
They were, weren't they? And I've actually costed it in the latest edition. I compared it with the house from the 11th edition, which was 2015, and it's gone up 8% a year, which is a hell of a lot. That's an inflation rate of 8% a year in building, when the published national inflation rate was, well, for a long time, it was virtually zero, wasn't it? And it's gone up, obviously, the last couple of years that we've had inflation of 10% or so. But it seems to be a lot higher than that. Partly that's to do with house building, or this end of it, going up market. I think I'm right in saying this, there are probably fewer self-builds now than there were 10 years ago. Not drastically, but the amount of money spent on it has gone up quite a lot, so each build is more expensive. Quite why it's hard to put your finger on exactly, but in a way, self-building has become more fashionable thanks to its TV exposure and the RBA and people like that. And it's attracting a richer crowd who are coming in and speccing it higher. Things like passive house, renewables, heat pumps, all this stuff costs more than what the developers are building. Let's face it, the homes we were building in the 90s and the noughties were pretty basic. The Brits don't spend much on building compared to a lot of other countries. But also materials, I say, as you know, they're just getting more expensive. And it was triggered by the collapse in demand when the pandemic was on, followed by complete shortage in all sorts of materials, and people were having delays getting hold of stuff. I think they still are. It's still not clear that everything's as it was before. So that's a market stricture, and prices shot up. They've started to come down. I sort of track the prices of basic building materials, just like on Travis Perkins' website and things like that. I've got little graphs of how it's all going. But they haven't come back nearly where they were. I mean, timber's a good example. Timber more than doubled in price, which is a phenomenal amount for a very basic product, isn't it? It didn't help that a lot of it was coming from Russia. Of course, that stopped the moment the Russians invaded Ukraine. And it takes a while to readjust the supply lines, doesn't it? So stuff is just a lot more expensive. Having said that, there's still a lot of money out there. There's a hell of a lot of building going on. And here we are in central Cambridge. You will see builders' vans left, right and centre. There's no shortage of demand, even though the prices have shot through. So I think we're seeing some projects delayed or postponed. Some of them will be indefinitely, and others will be in trouble where people simply can't finish them. In a way, that's always been a problem with self-build. People, they get 3/4 of the way through and they run out of cash, and they end up spending their third or fourth year in a caravan. Normally they get there eventually, So there'll be more of that going on. But certainly it's been the main feature of my work on my latest edition, seeing how the price rises have filtered through and what effect it's had on the overall cost of a house. What was interesting to me was that a lot of the basic materials have gone up dramatically, but a lot of the finished materials, things like kitchens and bathrooms and paint and that sort of stuff, is unchanged. Now, it may have been that they had big fat margins originally and that they've allowed the fat to be taken up. But it's not all building materials have gone up. It's actually quite selective about the price rises that happened. And it's a funny business building. One of the tricks that the manufacturers use, plasterboard is a great example. Plasterboard was introduced in the 1950s, the post-war years, and it was a completely revolutionary product. It came over from America, a sandwich of gypsum plaster between two sheets. Back then, you'll find it would have been about, a sheet of plasterboard would have been about £5. And lo and behold, in the 1990s, it was still £5. But what happened? They were making plasterboard with much lighter materials. They were basically sort of de-inflation. So that had an effect on the soundproofing, because the original plasterboard worked quite well. By the time they sort of got the aerated gypsum in there, it was like having a sheet of newspaper in terms of soundproofing. So the standards were getting lower. But lo and behold, the headline price was exactly the same. It was, I get plasterboard, fine, no problem. But it wasn't the same product. So that was a good example of how the building trade coped with inflation. But, you get to a point, even plasterboard's now doubled the price. So, something had to give eventually.
Yeah, that's happened to my crisps as well. When I open the packet, I'm always disappointed. There's nothing in there.
There's lots of bars of chocolate, aren't there? That get gently shorter and shorter and shorter, don't they? So hopefully the consumer doesn't notice.
Do you think we are seeing the rich getting richer and perhaps still driving that element of the construction industry, not the mass developer market? Is that something that's happening?
We're straying into politics here, Ben.
Maybe I'll cut myself off and say what a silly question that was.
I think it's a very good question, because I think you're probably spot on. People that are making good money are rolling it, but the majority of people are struggling, aren't they? And they're probably not the ones making lots of money. And interesting enough, you've been to Graven Hill, I'm sure, in your
well, this
travels.
This is quite. I'm going to pitch my next question, and you can talk about Graven Hill as well. Because what do you think we do then if we want to build a house, but we know money is tight, and we still want to go ahead with this, but we are going to want a low-cost house, or we'd like quality. I know I'm starting to think about your triangle. The cost, quality, time thing.
You can't escape from that. It's a pyramid, actually. It was materials invented by the Egyptians when they were building the pyramids. It's been the same ever since. The fact that you can have a cheap, good house, but it won't be quick, or a quick, good house, but it won't be cheap, or you can have a cheap, quick house, but it won't be any good. That dynamic, I guess, is going to last probably forever. An interesting aspect of this is that the self-build market was always divided between what went on in the southern wealthy parts of England and the sort of the Celtic fringes. In Scotland, Northern Ireland, places like that, land was more affordable, more available, and self-building took place on a much more basic level. People getting onto the housing ladder for the first time with a self-build, maybe with their dad was a joiner or something like that, but there'd be family in the trade. But to this day, you see lots of quite humble self-build projects. In the south of England, land prices are so expensive that it really is the preserve of the wealthy. You either got a very high income or substantial assets to even think about it, really. You can't just, on an ordinary wage, go out and get a mortgage and have enough money to do a self-build. And in a way, that's always been there, but I think it's just got more exaggerated, really. And what's your experience of it? Do you think that's the case, or...?
Yeah, I think it is. This is why I was going to lead into Graven Hill, whether that approach is really making a difference, because they are all homes there that take a bit of the risk out. That's the key thing. When you've not got much money, you want to tie down those costs.
Well, Graven Hill seems from my limited view, I've been there, 3 or 4 times, is dividing in exact that way. The house up on the hill, the self-builds are actually very grand houses. They're all completely different. It's chaotic, and in the great sort of Dutch self-build, all of these people, you've got completely different styles, but they're all quite grand houses, aren't they? Lower down the hill, we've got the custom builds, and they look much like you'd see on a developer house anywhere in the country. And the process isn't that different, except that you're invited to come in and maybe choose the wall tiles and maybe the bathroom fittings, and there's some element of customization, but essentially you're going in and buying a house from a developer, taking the risk out of it. It's so, in a way, as I see it, Gravenhill is in itself subdividing into two different markets. I don't know if you read it like that.
I think I need to go back there because it's probably a good few years.
Yeah.
I was there maybe in the early days a couple of times, but...
There's the section where Grand Designs did the street, the original programme with 8 houses, and round the back of that there's now some show houses. Dan House are there. There's quite a good company, which is Polish, which is doing quite a bit of work there. And Build It have done their own exhibition.
That's one of my
house.
visits.
Yeah, you've been there. Yeah. So, but when you actually go up onto the sites, it's self-build in miniature. The higher up the hill you get, the more expensive the houses get.
So what would be your tips then for keeping costs down?
I hate the phrase value engineering, but that's really what it amounts to. You have to set your sites realistically, which is a very difficult one, because one of the thrills people have of doing major building work is to put some fancy ideas in place, and it's quite a hard pill to swallow when you find out you can't afford them. On this very street, there's a green retrofit taking place, and they went through absolute hell with I think on their 3rd iteration, each one getting simpler than the one before, till they get down to what they can actually afford, and you can sort of see the disappointment in their eyes. That they were hoping to do a wonderful house, and it was going to, and suddenly they're doing a really nice house, but it's not quite what they had in mind, and that is basically what you have to come to terms with. You have to cut your cloth accordingly. And there's no easy way around it. There's no magical way. You can suddenly go to this builder's merchant and get half the price, so you'll find a wonderful plumber who's much cheaper than all the others. Not really. You might save a bit here and there, but essentially you're in control of the budget and you've got to cut your cloth accordingly. And that's a very difficult one. The other difficult point, of course, is that you don't know how much it's going to cost. That you do these plans and you can hire, probably one way around this, to hire a quantity surveyor to go through it with a fine-tooth comb and try and work out what this is going to cost in real terms. But even quantity surveyors don't always get it right. You could say it's common sense, but it's not common sense, because you're dealing with costs that, if you've never built before, you're not familiar with what they should be and what they might be. Really educate yourself and get professional help. I would personally, yes, we hired a quantity surveyor, despite the fact that I write a book on is building costs at the centre of it. Even I get nervous when I see a set of plans and think, how much is it going to cost? Can I estimate it to the nearest 100,000, let alone to the nearest 5,000? It is common sense, but it's complicated. So it's only common sense when you looked at it in hindsight. Quite often you're looking at a sort of cloudy picture of costs bubbling up, you've no idea what they're going to be.
When you mentioned the retrofit project going on, sometimes you think you have a decent amount of money, but then it doesn't go so far. So when do you know that you're in a safe place with money? You've got enough of a budget there? Is it just once you've got the land, once you've been to your QS, it's just tricky?
Again, it's a very good question. I'm not sure there is such a golden point when you really know you're going to be there.
Because again, this to me just hints back to people who've already got the money, and sometimes they might go over budget, but they'll get it back because the market has gone up eventually, so long as they can keep going.
Yeah. I was visiting a project in Somerset, huge barn conversion they were doing, and they were basically halfway through it, and it looked like funds were getting short, and they were scratching their head trying to work out how the hell they're going to finish this thing. And I'm sure they'll get there eventually, but one way is to extend it out, and instead of taking a year or 18 months, it ends up taking 5 years, something like that, and people going out and working and bringing in funds. Or
that has a toll, though. I've seen that story.
Yeah, I mean, you've been doing your interviewing long enough to know what the pitfalls are, aren't you? There's no magic bullet here that can say this is the way to do it and you'll never go wrong.
Yeah, I think this is a hard sell on trying to keep costs down. I don't know what else to mention about it. You need money. That's the answer.
Well, I don't know what to say really. I'd love to have a bullet point of a sheet with 6 bullet points on the things you can do to save money. I'd actually often see articles like that in the magazines, don't you? And you read through them and think, well, yeah, that's obvious. Yeah, that's obvious too. That's also obvious. This is common sense, isn't it? But having said that, is it really going to save me money? And other than being careful in the planning and, dare I say, be a bit dull. Oh my God, I can't say that, can I?
Okay, different tack here. Your book then, are you trying to guide people to a particular approach at the end of this? I'll put my hands up here. My bias is always towards healthy, comfortable, energy efficient homes. But how have you gone over the years?
Yeah, I think I'm right with you on that. I started my building career in 1980 doing a green retrofit on a house in Cambridge. And it's always been my abiding interest and passion ever since, really. And to me, it's common sense. I think a lot of people don't get that, and I've quite a lot of emphasis in the last edition about just how lovely it is to have a warm, comfortable, well-ventilated house. It beats having a 24-inch TV screen or a £50,000 kitchen any day of the week. And just the pleasure of coming into a lovely warm space in the middle of winter is fantastic. And also having a well-ventilated space, because British homes by and large are not. They're stuffy as hell, or they're leaky. And stuff like that to me seems common sense, but a lot of people it isn't common sense. They no idea what you're talking about. They see the surface, they see the beautiful wallpapers or wonderful stair carpets, or they spend the whole time going around with mood boards trying to work out how to get this right and how to get the view down the end of the garden, having huge glazed screens, bring the outside inside. That's another trap people fall into, isn't it? And they miss the whole great thing you can get, and that has come on in leaps and bounds since 1980, since I first got involved in this business, about how to build a comfortable house. And that's largely down to the Wolfgang and the whole passive house movement, which has been a great help, because you go back 20 years before that and people were arguing about how you did it. There were passive solar houses and people with trom walls they were building and funny ways of ventilating houses and all sort of experimental stuff, all great, but most of it didn't work. And to reduce it to sort of simple few physical attributes, you do this, you do that, and you do it well and it'll work. And that's a great help. And I'm fully behind that, and I try and press people into doing that. Whether they do, I don't know. Some people get it. A lot of people have no idea what you're on about.
What I always like to think is that you show what is possible and then everyone else will take what they can and go down their route. But if you set the bar, that's always a nice thing to do.
Interestingly, I've just been in Perth in Australia, and I wasn't there. I was on a family visit. I wasn't investigating the building scene, but you can't help noticing, and I did have a really interesting conversation with a couple of British architects living out there. They're far more worried about bushfires than they are about energy saving. And you can understand why. Much of Australia is a sort of tinderbox these days, isn't it? And they thought they were very radical in putting double glazing in their house, that all the fellow architects in their office were doing up their houses and no one was using anything other than single glazing. You can't use single glazing because we stopped using that in the 1970s in this country. But, they've got a very different climate, so maybe it's not nuts. But it's interesting how people's perceptions of what's good cutting-edge architecture is. And for them, a lot of it is about building materials that won't burn. Waiting for the embers to come glowing over the horizon. Well, who knows? Maybe that'll be a British concern in the next 20, 30 years.
Well, it's a very good point, isn't it? I'll just quickly chip in one story I remember about Australia. My brother lives out on the other coast near Sydney, and I went to visit some friends in what must have been a terribly built house, and they had this air conditioning units because everyone was so boiling.
Yep.
And you had to sit right beside it to get even the slightest bit of benefit, just to cool down your hands or whatever. But to me, that just said the fabric of this place, not so good. Let's round things off then today, just coming back to the Housebuilder's Bible. I always recommend it as a great book to have as your companion through. But what does it offer for someone who's coming in today, starting their journey? It's a cycle, isn't it, really, building a house? So as a newcomer, how do you like to pitch it?
The idea behind the book remains exactly the same today as it did when I started it as a project. And I call it a project now more than just a book. To be a hand-holding exercise, to explain the process, and without trying to sell anything. I'm not selling any services, any materials, just good old-fashioned, hard-earned experience put down on a page. So much of the information out there you can get on the internet these days, but so often comes loaded with actually what they're doing is they're selling a service. They want you to use their service, and they've got the best way of doing it since sliced bread was invented. And I'm not doing that. I'm simply putting 40 years of distilled knowledge on the house building scene into a book, and you can make what you want of it. You can take a few hints I'm making, but you don't have to, and you can take some of the errors out of the process, but you're free to, I'm not telling you you're right or you're wrong. I'm just simply putting as much helpful information in a book form, which is something I feel comfortable doing, whereas I don't feel comfortable doing videos or web pages. I like books, I like writing, and I like reading off the page. But there are hundreds of thousands of people out there thinking of this journey who would like to at least know some of the pros and cons without any commercial spin on it. I'm not trying to force you down any route.
Mark, it is always good to have a chat with you. I appreciate your time today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ben. It's been great talking.
Head online to take a look at the show notes that accompany this session at houseplanninghelp.com/339. You can review the key points in our summary that we provide. You can make a comment if you scroll down to the bottom of the show notes. We've also got social media links too. And of course, I'm going to link you to the Housebuilder's Bible, all at houseplanninghelp.com/339. My call to action is to check out the hub and think of boot camp. We're going to take things up a level, keep the training going, and you can go through this at your own pace. That's the whole idea. Perhaps you've had enough of it. Well, you just unsubscribe. We make it all easy, but we lay before you things like our in-depth video case studies, which we've been doing over the last few years, so you can access all of those. The courses, we've got Ask the Expert now. We've got the office hour calls if you want to have a chat with me. We've got our community forum, live training sessions, and no doubt, like Mark with his book, we'll be playing around with it. We just want to make it effective so that it can help you on your self-build or retrofit journey. Have a look, houseplanninghelp.com/join. Thank you so much for being there. The House Planning Help podcast is produced by Regen Media, content that matters.